Hello everyone, welcome back to the Unstoppable Dad Project. I'm back for another week after taking a week off. Last week I had a little bit of stuff on, including my birthday and a nice little trip to the emergency ward with my children, who are both fine right now, but it was just something precautionary that we had to do to make sure that it wasn't too much of an issue for what was going on. Before I get started on today's podcast and the topic I'm going to cover off today, I just wanted to take some time to thank each and every one of you for tuning in. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to listen to our little podcast. And if I could ask you one favor, jump on, like, share, subscribe. Share it with the people that you think are going to be able to get some value or some enjoyment out of what we do, because it is only through you and with you that we will be able to grow this podcast, and we will be able to get that information out there. So if you could go ahead and do that, I would be forever appreciative, and we can continue to grow this thing and keep this thing moving forward. So today, or when I'm recording this podcast, it will be released. It will probably be released at a later date, but today is the 23rd of March. And while the 23rd of March for some people may not be a historic date in their calendar, the 23rd of March in my calendar last year became a date that I will always remember. Now, also happens to be a full week after my birthday, but this time last year, we had to close our business down, a business that we have been involved in and had for over the last decade. It's a business that, as cliche as it sounds, I have poured everything into financially, emotionally, physically. We've put every ounce of blood, sweat, tears, and cash into this place to try and grow it into the point that it's at. And on the 22nd, 6 p.m., there was a press conference that came on where the Prime Minister of Australia, so if you're listening to this in another country, I'm sure you've gone through the same thing where COVID forced every business to shut down. And the way it went down here is, and I'll remember it so vividly, where I was sitting down at the kitchen table. So part of my, weekly routine, and it has been for a while and I still do this now, is I will sit down and I will write myself out a task list for the week on Sunday night. And I'll kind of accumulate this task list leading up to Sunday, but then I'll refine it on Sunday. And I'll never forget, I was sitting down at the table at 6 o'clock and this press conference came on. The Prime Minister jumps on and he goes, all these businesses, which was the vast majority of businesses within Australia, need to be closed by 12 noon tomorrow. So by lunchtime tomorrow, we need to be completely closed. No more access to the facilities that we're paying rent on. This is just what needs to happen in order to flatten the curve for COVID, because back then that was the narrative. We needed to flatten the curve. That's changed now, but we'll leave my thoughts on that for either another podcast or for those that are interested in another format. But it was a shock, even though 2 weeks prior to, for almost 2 weeks prior to it, I'd been planning that I knew that something like this was bound to happen. So from the point of view of what we were trying to do from a business perspective, I'd started to roll particular things out, and I had a plan, because one of my ways of thinking is, for a lot of what I do, start off at worst case scenario and work back from there. And I've always been, a big believer in, if I can plan for the worst, then if anything under that happens, we're okay, we'll be okay. As long as we know what the worst case scenario is, I'll work back from there. So I'd preempted that something like this could happen just due to the information that was being out there, talking to some people who are smarter than me about that particular thing, and we'd started to do it. But the way it was done so quickly and so swiftly that it was even a shock with a plan. And anyway, the next day came in. We had to close the business down, and at this point, we had no idea how long we were going to be closed for. I had a rough plan on what I was going to do for our clients to try and keep business ticking over, but there was just so many unknown and unknowables, and I just didn't know exactly what was going on. And then to boot everything else on top of that, I didn't know how long we were going to be closed for. I didn't know how individuals that we service, so our clientele were going to be affected, because obviously throughout that time everyone had such a varying degree of experience, their own individual experience, because everybody was in such a different situation. People were in similar situations to us, where they owned a business, they were no longer able to run a business. Some of those businesses weren't able to pivot. They were just simply shut down. For us, we were lucky enough that we were able to kind of pivot a little bit, and we were able to move into something where we were at least able to keep some form of revenue come in. We didn't know what was going to happen with like rent that we were paying. Were we going to be able to continue to afford that? There were all these unknown and these unknowables, but the thing that I chose to focus on was the plan that I had and trying to execute that the best I could. And having that plan really, really helped. But like today, being that it's the anniversary of that happening, the 1 year anniversary of that happening, and this not only happened in Australia, this happened all over the world, to the point where, you know, I'm seeing that there's some places that have been shut down for the last 12 months. Luckily, that wasn't us. But because it's the year of that happening, I've been quite retrospective. I've been, I guess sentimental is a word, but I've been really thinking about the last 12 months and how it has affected me, how I have grown throughout the last 12 months, how business has changed, how life has changed. But realistically, I'm thinking about the things that I'm thankful for over the last 12 months. And there was so much stuff that happened in a very, very short period of time that it wasn't until we were probably 3 or 4 weeks in to the lockdown that I really got to a point where I was kind of settled with what was going on. As in, I was able to get back to a routine, what that looked like. You know, I was able to start to kind of get my head around, righto, we need to settle in for this, because initially we thought it may have only been 2 weeks. We thought, we didn't know whether it was going to be 2 weeks or it was going to be 6 months. We didn't know whether we were going, at that point, whether we were going to reopen. I didn't know, you know, there was just so many unknown and unknowables and things that were outside of my circle of influence. But it wasn't until I got about a month in that I really started to get back into a routine and started to be able to appreciate the things and the freedoms that I had at that point. And, you know, one of the things I'm very grateful for was that time that I got to be able to be home and spend with my family. Because to give you an idea, and those of you and everyone that's listening, I assume is having children. If you don't, it's going to be one hell of a ride. But for me, one of the things that really stood out for me is our youngest. He was not even a year old yet. And my daughter, my eldest, when she started walking and crawling and moving, like I didn't work fly in, fly out where I was away for a week. Like I was going home every night. But having your own business, those of you that own your own business, there's 12-hour days some days, there's 14-hour days, like there's big days. So you go home and you see them at night, and then when sometimes things, even though you're home on the weekend, things happen, like they go from, you know, rolling onto their stomach to crawling and then to walking, and that can sometimes happen pretty quickly. And I didn't get to see a lot of that in person firsthand. I got to see it through videos that my wife was sending, and then like after it had happened. So, and I was still present for it. But over COVID, that stuff started happening with my son. And I was there and present and in person for every single kind of step, excuse the pun, but yeah, as he started to walk. And that was like one thing that I'm very grateful for. If we weren't forced to shut down, it would have been the same scenario as my daughter. So that's one thing. The time with family was a big thing for me. The other thing is coming up with the Unstoppable Dad project. And realistically, had it not been for that time, I don't know that I'd be sitting here doing this podcast for you to listen to and for me to enjoy doing like I am now. Because what it gave me was it gave me a little bit of time, and it gave me space to create and start to create this program, and not only create this program, but create stuff for our other business as well too. And while so much of that stuff was very hectic and very worrying and very stressful, because a lot of it was, actually I'm going to say all of it was financial stress, because the rug just got pulled out from underneath us, and we didn't even know whether, like, you know, we knew that there was a plan, and I knew that I could pivot and we could do some online stuff, but we didn't know, like, whether that was going to be enough to kind of keep everyone fed. And then obviously there's a job shortage and things like that, and trying not to rely on the government for help and for handouts. This obviously caused financial stress, but realistically, outside of that, there wasn't a whole bunch of stress. In fact, it was an enjoyable time where I have a lot to be thankful for. I'm thankful for my family. I'm thankful being a part of seeing my children's development firsthand, and not having to see it through videos or just at night time. And I'm thankful for the ability to get a little bit more creative and grow. And the reason I kind of go through all of that, and I mention that, is one, I guess this podcast is, it's a little bit of a journal for me to go back on one day and just have a listen to where my head was at, a year after something like that happened. I kind of wish that I had have done something, when we first closed, and see the difference between then and now. But that's number one. But number two is why I wanted to talk through that a little bit was simply talk about some things that I learned and some tools that I believe that I gained, some internal tools to really help me continue to grow after the fact, because there was so much stuff that was going on at that time that was outside of my control. And from my mental state and my mental health state, and on my last podcast I talked about the struggles that I had when I first became a dad, and it's this constant, I think if you ever go down, and this is just my theory, like I'm not a psychologist, I'm not a counselor. As I said in the last podcast, like if you're struggling with it, you need to reach out, you need to get help. But there's a theory that I have is, I think if you ever go down that path and you ever feel like that, because I've spoken to people who they've never felt like that, and that's awesome. But if you are a person that's felt like that, I think you're constantly going through this battle where you're constantly fighting it off. I don't think you ever truly stop, and there'll be certain things that will happen throughout your life that will probably trigger these emotions and feeling that way again. And the one thing that that high stress and all that unknown really did for me was it kind of started to trigger some of those emotions again. So the things that I really learnt, and I would do this a little bit beforehand, but I really had to kind of hone in on this while we were closed. And this is something that has really helped me moving forward since we've then been able to reopen. And then that 9 months between then and now is, number one, like really learning to accept that there are some things outside of your control and trying not to focus on that. Because I know when I focus on the uncontrollables and I keep looking at that and I keep going through my mind on how I can change those things, that sends me down a path where it's almost a spiral out of control where I find it hard to come back from. Like, that's number one, like understanding that there are things outside of your control and there's nothing you can do about that. And you almost just have to accept those things out of your control. Number two was putting that energy that you would spend worrying about those things outside of your control into things that you can control. And the thing is, this is a really fine line, right? Because in my coaching experience and in my life too, because I've done it, sometimes we will mistake things that are in our control for things that are outside of our control, and vice versa. And I think people are on different ends of the spectrum when we start to talk about this, right? Like, some people will self-blame until the cows come home, and they will be overcritical and they will beat themselves down and they will focus in on things and they will be like, it is all my fault, and they will take like that extreme self-ownership. And I think taking self-ownership is super important, don't get me wrong on that, but there are some people that I have met and I have dealt with, I have coached, and I am at times one of those people where it's like, nope, it's all on me, I've got to do it all myself. But then when you do that and you take everything on, you're not compartmentalizing that there are actually some things that are outside of your control. So it's a real juggling act. It's a real dichotomy where it's like you have to be real with yourself about what you can control and what you can't control. And over COVID, over that COVID period, over that COVID break, it really helped me come up with the tools, the internal tools, the mental tools to really ascertain what was what and what wasn't. And understanding that if I focus on the things that I can control and take actions around those things, I don't ever forget about the things I can't control, especially when you're in such a funny world and such a funny environment like we were then. And I mean, we're still in a funny place, but it's not like within Australia, it's not like it was during that 10, 12 weeks that everything was shut down. And if I take that time, energy, and effort, and the time, the energy, and the effort, and put it into stuff I control, the actions I'm taking on a daily basis, how I respond to things, and understanding that there are certain things within this that are outside of my control, then I can get a lot done and I can really shift things in a positive direction for myself. Whereas if I spend all that time focusing and worrying and stressing over things that I can't control, and it's okay to do that, but there comes a point where if you're continually looking at that stuff and you can't take your eyes off it, that it is going to beat you down. It's like running down a hill in a car with the handbrake off. You know, if you just keep looking at the handbrake and don't take some action to put it on, that car's going to keep going down that hill. And there's only one thing that's going to happen. It's going to crash into something at the bottom. So, you know, it's like just looking at it without taking action. And sometimes action's not going to cure everything. Like people will, but it can start to shift you in a direction where you can start to look at things a little bit more objectively and hopefully take some worry away from those other like the other things that are outside of your control. So, you know, one of the biggest things that I guess I learned and I was able to get into my head during that COVID period is, hey, like, there are things I can't control, there are things I can. Let's focus on the things I can and start moving forward. The other thing that other tool, I guess you'd call it, that I feel was something I really picked up and refined during COVID was focusing on the short term. Focusing on, you know, one day, 1 week at a time. And sometimes when you're a dad, and especially when you're a new dad, like, yes, you have in your head, I can say in my head, you know, you start planning out the future. You start planning out the future, and you start thinking about these things early on, like wanting to give the best to your kids, wanting to make sure they go to a good daycare, they go to a good school. You want to, you start planning that stuff out, and you start thinking down the road in a lot of stuff. And I don't think for a second that you don't need to do that, but I think all too often, and this not only goes for fathers, but I think this goes for a lot of people. And a lot of people that I've dealt with, everyone's looking too far down the road. And there's an old saying, I can't remember where I've heard it, but people tend to severely overestimate what they can do in 1 month, but underestimate what they can do in 10 years. Or something like that. I think that's the quote. I don't know. Basically the thing is, They try and do too much in the short term, thinking that that's going to have an impact on the long term. And what happens is, while we're trying to do all this stuff in the short term, and then especially if we're piling ourselves up with too much stuff in a period of high stress in our lives, we pile this stuff up, and we don't get little bits done, and things start falling off the plate, and then we start getting stressed about what we're missing out on. We start to put all this extra pressure on ourselves, and then all of a sudden, it all gets put in the too hard basket and we stop because we haven't gotten that short-term goal that we're looking for. Whereas if we just focused on being consistent and doing little things day to day, we'd be able to get further and further and further in front. And it means that we're not going to make big jumps short-term, but we're going to make bigger jumps long-term. And that was one of the things that happened during COVID, was me really working on just being consistent with action I was taking in every aspect of my life, rather than trying to take big chunks out of things in the really short term. Just focus on doing a couple of things each day, whether it be on the business, making sure I was being consistent with my training still, because I didn't have anywhere to go. It was all on me to have to do that. So I had to stay disciplined with it. And not only that, by building that consistency, if for some reason I did have an off week, the part B to that, or the second part that I really was able to refine over that period, is just being able to draw a line in the sand and move on to the next day or move on to the next week. Had a bad day, had a bad week, doesn't matter, reset, readjust, and move forward. And that enables you to build consistency. It doesn't mean that it's going to be exactly the same week in, week out. But it means that if you look at it over a 1 year, 2 year, 3 year, 5 year, 6 year period, the amount of stuff that you're going to be able to get done by just being consistent. So say, for example, if we take it back to training, by doing 3 hours a week consistently for 3 years, 52 weeks a year, that's 156. That's 480 odd hours of training that you've done over that time, rather than trying to do 6 hours of training a week, only doing that for a month, burning out, ending up having to take 3 months off, and then doing the same thing again. And you're only getting, if you're getting 6, you're getting 24 hours, and you're only doing that for a total of 3 or 4 months a year. It's not going to accumulate to the same amount as if you just consistently hit those 3 hours a week. And there'll be weeks where if you're trying to hit that 3, you might only hit 2. And that's okay. Rather than dwelling on the fact that you need to then make it up the next week, just adjust, reset, recalibrate, and then start to move forward. I'm going to get my 3 next week. And then there'll be the odd week where maybe you've got a little bit of a break in your schedule so you can get 4. So you kind of make it up along the line, but you don't aim to make it up. It just organically happens. And that means when you have a bad week or a bad day, rather than focusing on what you didn't do, focusing on what you can do. And during that COVID period, that COVID shutdown, this was something that really served me and still serves me a lot now. Like even last week, I just mentioned that I took the week off doing the podcast just due to, internal and external factors. Some of it had to do with me just simply not doing the work and wanting to have a day off, which is fine. Sometimes everybody just needs a fucking day off. But then also there was external stuff that stopped me from doing it, like the kids going to hospital. I can't control when the kids are sick, so I was unable to do it. So I kind of made the decision that I wasn't going to do it last week. I wasn't in a great headspace to do it. So then this week, rather than thinking that I've got to do 2 podcasts, I'm just like, no, I'm just going to get back to doing it again. And we're going to get back to doing it. We're going to continue to move forward. We're going to continue to do that. And then next week we'll do another one. And then next week we'll do another one. And then there might be the opportunity to pick up one down the track, but I'm not going to try and force it. I'm just going to focus on being consistent, because if I try and do 2, it's then going to get put in the too hard basket, and I'm not even going to get 1 done. So being able to draw that line in the sand was a really valuable tool and a really valuable help for me through that COVID period, because there would be days where I would just be so mentally fried with the stress of, even though I said earlier on that I tried not to focus on the things I couldn't control, sometimes it gets the best of you. And sometimes you do. And you focus on it for a whole day and it does your head in, and you just feel so mentally drained that you just can't conjure up the mental capacity to do the other stuff that you need to do. And that's okay. So you'll have days like that. But the difference between whether you continue to move forward or not is what you're going to do the next day or the next week. Are you going to draw that line in the sand and just keep going next week? Or do you dwell on the fact that you didn't do it? Because I think a really key thing is, yes, some days we're not going to get the work done. Some weeks we're not going to get the work done. We don't have to be perfect every day. But we need to be able to draw a line in the sand, readjust, recalibrate, and move forward. So, there's a lot of stuff I've kind of said on here, this 25 minutes that we've gone through today. I guess it was more, something that I wanted to do just to reflect on the last 12 months. And I guess hopefully give you gentlemen some tools or some things that I felt have helped me. And I felt helped me over the last 12 months. And the thing is, like, during that COVID period, it really highlighted some shortcomings that I needed to work on, and I was able to do that with the extra space I was given, and that's great, and that was awesome. And some people had that luxury, some people didn't. Hopefully my story helps you out, but I guess the biggest takeaways I want for you guys to take away is, number one, aim to be consistent with your action. Doesn't mean you're going to be perfect, but it just means you're consistently taking action and focusing on those things that you can control. The action you're taking and the energy you are putting in is being put into things that you control, not things you can't. Because when we put all our energy and effort into things we can't control, we get nothing done. And then on top of that, the ability to, when we have a bad day or a bad week, just draw a line in the sand and start moving forward again. Learning from if we have made a mistake, learning from our mistakes and moving forward, but you have to be able to draw that line in the sand, be objective about what is within your control and outside of your control. And that's important. That's a really hard task. And that's something that, I'll probably do another podcast on, because I struggle with being objective about that stuff to this day. And it's something that, as I've said earlier, that I think people are on different sides of it, but be objective with it, draw a line in the sand, move forward, because being able to do that, that's why we have the word unstoppable in this project, in this podcast. In my opinion, my definition of unstoppable is not that you don't mess up. It's not that things don't go wrong. It's not that you don't miss goals. It's that when those things happen and things adversely affect you, you continue to aim to move forward. Okay, you get knocked back, you don't get something done, you draw that line in the sand and you keep moving forward. And I guess that's the one thing that this whole COVID period has taught me, the shutdown, the months after we've reopened to now, is what you want to do is you want to be unstoppable. You want to keep moving forward. You want to keep going and do your thing, Dad. Do your thing. Thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed it. Bye.